The air inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony is not merely quiet, it is heavy. It presses down with the weight of 2,000 years, smelling of old sandalwood, cold bronze, and the terrifying silence of absolute power. It is the autumn of 1793. Outside, the world is churning. Revolutions are bleeding through France. Steam engines are beginning to hiss in England. But here, in the heart of Beijing, time seems to have frozen into gold and lacquer. The Qianlong Emperor, the Son of Heaven, sits upon the dragon throne. He is 82 years old, a living deity wrapped in yellow silk. Before him, the floor is polished so perfectly it reflects the trembling faces of those who kneel. To look up is a crime. To speak without permission is death. There is a belief here, as solid as the high red walls surrounding the Forbidden City, that this empire is the center of the universe, that everything under the sky belongs to this one man. But listen closely. Beyond the rhythmic chanting of the eunuchs and the rustle of silk robes, there is a faint, discordant sound. It is the clicking of foreign boots on stone. A British ship is anchored at the coast, carrying gifts of telescopes and clocks, machines that measure a different kind of time. The emperor smiles, dismissive and serene, unaware that the sun is already setting. He believes the walls will keep the world out forever. He is wrong. This is the story of the last great dynasty, the golden cage of the Qing, and the thunderous collapse that would shake the earth. As we walk through the twilight of the imperial age, tracing the path from the frozen north to the burning summer palace, I invite you to join our journey into the archives of the past. If you wish to witness history as it truly breathed and bled, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us open the gates together. Chapter 1. The Wolf and the Wall, 1644 to 1661. To understand how the world turned upside down, we must first turn our backs on the golden roofs of Beijing and look north. We must travel beyond the Great Wall, into a land where the wind does not merely blow, it cuts. This is Manchuria in the early 17th century. It is a world of dense pine forests, frozen rivers, and relentless, unforgiving white. Here, survival is not a given. It is a prize won daily against the elements. For centuries, the people here, the Jurchen, were hunters and fishermen, living in the shadow of the colossal Ming Empire to the south. To the Ming scholars in their silk robes, these northerners were nothing more than barbarians, disparate tribes of savages who smelled of wet fur and horse sweat. The Ming believed that the Great Wall, that dragon of stone winding across the mountains, would separate the civilized from the wild forever. They believed that stone was stronger than will. They were wrong. Under the leadership of a chieftain named Nurhaci, and later his son Huang Taiji, the scattered tribes were not merely united, they were forged into a weapon. They created the 8 Banners, a system that organized every family, every man, and every arrow into a color-coded military machine. It was a society mobilized entirely for war. While the Ming court was drowning in the slow poison of factionalism and corruption, the Manchus were hardening. They were waiting. They were the wolves pacing outside the gate, watching the house of the Ming begin to rot from the inside out. And the rot was deep. By 1644, Beijing was a city of ghosts before it was even a city of the dead. The Ming Dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 300 years, had exhausted its mandate of heaven. The treasury was empty, drained by wars and the insatiable greed of court eunuchs who wielded more power than the generals. Nature itself seemed to have turned against the Chinese. A mini ice age had caused harvests to fail year after year. Famine stalked the countryside, so severe that in some provinces the unthinkable became commonplace, starving families trading children for food. From this desperation rose a rebellion, not from the foreign north, but from within. A peasant leader named Li Zicheng, the dashing king, swept through the country, gathering an army of the hungry and the hopeless. He marched on Beijing, and the walls that had stood for centuries suddenly seemed made of paper. April 25th, 1644. This is a date etched in the blackest ink of Chinese history. The sensory reality of Beijing on this day is one of suffocating panic. Smoke from the outer suburbs, set ablaze by the rebel army, drifted over the forbidden city, blotting out the sun. The sound of cannons grew louder, a rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the floorboards of the imperial palace. Inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the Chongzhen Emperor, the last ruler of the Ming, sat alone. He was 33 years old, a man who had tried to purge the corruption, who had stayed up late reading petitions, who had worn simple clothes to save money. But he was too late. The machinery of the state had rusted solid. Eyewitness accounts describe a scene of tragic abandonment. As the rebels breached the outer gates, the emperor desperately struck the great iron bell to summon his ministers for one final council. He rang it until his hands were raw. The sound echoed through the vast empty courtyards. No one came. The ministers had fled, or they were hiding in their mansions, preparing to defect to the new rulers. The emperor was left with only a faithful eunuch, Wang Zhen. The isolation was absolute. The man who ruled all under heaven could not command a single soldier to stand by his side. In a final act of despair and twisted mercy, the emperor returned to his private quarters. He could not allow the women of his family to fall into the hands of the rebels. With a sword heavy in his trembling hand, he forced the empress to commit suicide. He then turned to his own daughters. He killed the youngest and severed the arm of the eldest, the Princess Changping, who tried to block the blow. The screams of his family mixed with the roar of the invasion outside. It was a carnage born of love and shame. Under the cover of darkness, with the sky glowing orange from the fires of his burning capital, the Chongzhen Emperor climbed the artificial hill behind the palace, known as Coal Hill. He looked down at the city his ancestors had built. He bit his finger until it bled and wrote a final message on the lapel of his blue robe. I am insufficient in virtue and weak in conduct, hence the heavenly punishment. The rebels may dismember my corpse, but let them not hurt a single one of my people. He then took a sash of white silk, threw it over the branch of a locust tree, and hanged himself. As his body swung in the cold wind of dawn, the Ming Dynasty died with him. But the vacuum he left would not be filled by the peasant rebels for long. The wolves were at the wall, and the gate was about to be opened. History often turns on the hinge of a single decision, a single moment where personal grief outweighs national duty. For the Ming, that hinge was a man named Wu Sangui. He was a general, tasked with guarding the Shanhai Pass, the eastern end of the Great Wall, the critical choke point where the mountains meet the sea. He commanded the finest army left in China, the last bulwark against the Manchu forces waiting on the other side. Wu was caught in an impossible vice.
Behind him, Beijing had fallen to the peasant rebels who had driven his emperor to suicide. In front of him stood the Manchus, the sworn enemies of his civilization. But the calculus of war is rarely just about flags or borders. Often, it is about flesh and blood. The rebel leader, Li Zicheng, had taken Wu's father hostage in Beijing. Even more famously, legends and historians alike whispered that the rebels had captured Wu's favorite concubine, the beautiful Chen Yuanyuan. Enraged by the violation of his home and the collapse of his world, General Wu made the unthinkable choice. He would not fight the barbarians. He would invite them in.
Picture the scene at Shanhai Pass in May 1644. The heavy iron-bound gates, which had stayed shut against the northern wind for generations, groaned open. The Manchu cavalry, tens of thousands strong, did not have to scale the walls, they rode through them. Their horses' hooves thundered on the stone pavement, a sound that signaled the end of one era and the violent birth of another. They wore heavy brigandine armor studded with iron rivets, their helmets topped with red tassels that streamed in the wind. To the Chinese soldiers watching them pass, they must have looked like demons from folklore. But on that day, they were allies, or so General Wu told himself. The combined force of Wu's Ming loyalists and the Manchu banners swept down toward Beijing like a landslide. The peasant rebels, drunk on their sudden victory and ill-disciplined, crumbled before the organized ferocity of the Manchus. The battle was short, bloody, and decisive. The Manchus entered Beijing not as guests, but as conquerors. They buried the last Ming emperor with honors, claiming they had come to punish the rebels who killed him, a brilliant political stroke that positioned them as the avengers of the Ming rather than its destroyers. But they did not leave. They took the dragon throne. A 6-year-old boy, the Shunzi emperor, was placed upon it, the first of the Qing Dynasty to rule from Beijing. But capturing a capital is not the same as capturing a country. China is vast, a tapestry of mountains, rivers, and thousands of years of stubborn tradition. The Han Chinese, the ethnic majority, viewed the Manchus as uncivilized usurpers. The resistance was fierce, particularly in the south. The Qing response to this resistance would sear the collective memory of the nation. It wasn't just a war of armies, it became a war over the body itself. In 1645, the Qing court issued the Q order. It was a decree that was chilling in its simplicity. Keep your hair and lose your head. Keep your head and lose your hair. Every Han Chinese male was ordered to adopt the Manchu hairstyle, shaving the front of the forehead and braiding the remaining hair into a long pigtail or queue. To the Manchus, this was a sign of loyalty, a visual proof of submission. To the Han Chinese, whose Confucian values taught that the body, hair, and skin were gifts from one's parents and should not be damaged, it was a profound spiritual mutilation. It was a humiliation designed to wear every day. The enforcement was brutal. In cities across the empire, executioners set up blocks in the market squares. Soldiers would stop men in the street. Those who refused to shave were beheaded on the spot. The gutters of the Jiangnan region, the cultural heartland of China, ran red. The city of Yangzhou became a symbol of this terror. When the city refused to surrender, the Qing commander ordered a massacre that lasted 10 days. The sensory accounts of the Yangzhou massacre are the stuff of nightmares. The smell of burning timber mixing with the copper scent of blood. The piles of bodies so high they blocked the canals. The silence that fell over a city that had once been famous for its poetry and silk. One scholar who survived wrote, "I read by the light of the fires that consumed my neighbors." It was a lesson written in fire. The Qing were here to stay. They would not be absorbed, they would rule. Yet violence alone could not hold all under heaven. The Manchus were vastly outnumbered, perhaps 300 to 1. They realized that to rule China, they had to become Chinese, at least in appearance. The brilliance of the early Qing lay in this duality. They kept their Manchu identity, their language, their horsemanship, their military organization, but they adopted the administrative machinery of the Ming. They reinstated the civil service exams, allowing Han scholars to rise in government. They worshipped at the Temple of Heaven. They patronized the arts. The Shunji emperor, though young and often overshadowed by his regent uncle Dorgan, began this delicate dance. He was a tragic figure, a romantic soul trapped in the iron cage of protocol. He fell deeply in love with a concubine, Dongo, and when she died young, his grief was so consuming that he reportedly died of a broken heart, or smallpox, the great killer of the age, at only 23. His reign was the bridge over the chasm of chaos. He left behind a fragile peace, a conquered but restless empire, and a son who would grow up to be perhaps the greatest monarch the world has ever seen. The wolf had breached the wall, settled into the palace, and was now learning to read the classics. The consolidation was over. The golden age was about to dawn.
Chapter 2. The High Noon of Heaven, 1661 to 1796. If the early Qing was a storm of fire and iron, the era that followed was the stillness of a vast sunlit ocean. We enter the reign of the Kangxi Emperor, a man who ascended the throne as a child of 7 and died as the longest reigning ruler in Chinese history. He was not merely an emperor, he was a phenomenon. Imagine a boy sitting on a throne too big for him, his feet barely touching the floor, surrounded by ambitious regents who viewed him as a puppet. The most dangerous of these was Oh Boy, a decorated warrior with a chest full of scars and a heart full of arrogance. Oh Boy believed the empire belonged to the strong, and he treated the young emperor with thinly veiled contempt. But Kangxi possessed a weapon Oh Boy did not understand: patience. At age 14, in a coup that plays out like a chessmaster's final move, Kangxi arrested Oh Boy with a group of young guards he had trained under the guise of playing wrestling games. Oh Boy was thrown into prison, and the boy took the helm of the ship. The Kangxi era was an explosion of intellect. He was a scholar warrior, a man who would spend his mornings hunting tigers on the steppes and his evenings studying Euclid's geometry with Jesuit missionaries. He was fascinated by Western science, by the ticking clocks and telescopes brought from Europe, seeing them not as threats, but as tools to better understand the heavens. He opened the ports for trade, commanded the compilation of the great Kangxi dictionary, and personally led armies into the Gobi Desert to crush the Mongol threats. Under him, the bleeding stopped, the population exploded, the granaries filled. But the price of greatness is often a heavy inheritance. When Kangxi died in 1722, he left behind a succession crisis that nearly tore the family apart. From the shadows emerged his fourth son, Yin Shen, who became the Yongzheng emperor. If Kangxi was the expansive sun, Yongzheng was the cold, hard frost that kills the weeds. He is one of the most misunderstood figures in Chinese history, stern, paranoid, and utterly tireless. History often paints him as a usurper, claiming he changed his father's will, but the reality is more practical. He was the only one ruthless enough to do the job. Yongzheng did not sleep. He lived in the hall of mental cultivation, working by candlelight until 4 in the morning, reading reports from the provinces. He hated corruption with a visceral passion. While his father had been lenient with old comrades who dipped their hands into the treasury, Yongzheng struck them down. He confiscated their estates, threw them in dungeon cells, and reformed the tax system so the rich finally paid their share.
There is a somatic intensity to his reign, the smell of red vermilion ink. Yongzheng personally annotated the memorials sent by his officials, writing more than 10 million words of commentary in his 13-year reign. His handwriting is energetic, angry, and direct. On one report from a fawning official, he scribbled, "Do not lie to me. I am not a fool." He worked himself to death, quite literally, burning out at the age of 58. But he left the treasury overflowing with silver. He had built the foundation for the final act of glory. He handed his son a loaded gun and a full bank account. And so, in 1735, the baton passed to the Qianlong emperor. If Kangxi was the builder and Yongzheng was the housekeeper, Qianlong was the heir who lived to spend the fortune. His reign was the climax of the dynasty, a 60-year pageant of such blinding splendor that it dazzled the entire world. Under Qianlong, the Qing Empire reached its geographic zenith. Look at a map of modern China. The shape of the rooster we see today was carved out by Qianlong's armies. He marched west into the deserts of Xinjiang, south into the jungles of Burma, and high onto the plateaus of Tibet. He called himself the Old Man of 10 Perfect Victories, and for a long time it seemed true. He was the universal ruler, a Khan to the Mongols, a Chakravartin king to the Buddhists, and the Son of Heaven to the Han Chinese. The sensory world of Qianlong was one of exquisite refinement. He was a man obsessed with beauty and legacy. He wrote over 40,000 poems, more than any other poet in history, though few were masterpieces. He was a voracious collector, stamping his red seal of ownership directly onto ancient paintings, asserting his dominion over culture itself. But his greatest creation was not a poem or a war. It was a garden. Northwest of Beijing, he expanded the Yuanming Yuan, the old summer palace. This was not merely a park, it was a dreamscape of all under heaven condensed into miniature. It had lakes filled with golden carp, replicas of southern Chinese towns where eunuchs posed as shopkeepers for the emperor's amusement, and even European-style stone palaces designed by Jesuit architects, complete with fountains and mazes. It was the garden of perfect brightness, a paradise on earth where the emperor could escape the suffocating rituals of the Forbidden City. Here, surrounded by ticking European clocks and jade carvings, the Qing reached its peak aesthetic perfection.
But fruit that hangs too long on the vine begins to spoil. As Qianlong grew older, his judgment began to fray. The discipline of his father Yongzheng evaporated, replaced by a culture of indulgence and sycophancy. And from this rot emerged a figure who would become the face of Qing decline, Hessian. Hessian was a young imperial bodyguard, handsome, charming, and possessed of a smooth tongue. He caught the eye of the aging emperor. Some say he resembled a past love of Qianlong's, and his rise was meteoric. Within a few years, he held nearly every important post in the government. He controlled the Board of Revenue, the Board of Civil Appointments, and the Grand Council. He became the gatekeeper. No one could speak to the emperor without bribing Hessian first. The scale of Hessian's corruption is difficult to comprehend even in modern terms. He did not just skim off the top, he drained the ocean. When he was eventually arrested, his personal fortune was found to exceed the entire annual revenue of the Qing Empire for 15 years. He owned thousands of rooms of real estate, bowls of solid gold, and cellars filled with silver bullion. While the emperor wrote poems about the prosperity of the peasants, Hessian was selling government posts to the highest bidder. The administration ceased to function as a government and began to function as a crime syndicate. The consequences were felt in the soil. The yellow river dikes, neglected by corrupt officials who pocketed the maintenance funds, burst their banks. Famine returned. In the hills of the White Lotus Society, a religious sect began to organize rebellion, fueled by the anger of the starving peasantry. The 10 perfect victories had cost a fortune, and now the bills were coming due. It was in this twilight of glitter and rot that the British arrived. In 1793, Lord George Macartney sailed into Tianjin with a simple request: better trade terms. He brought gifts intended to impress the emperor with British technology, hot air balloons, planetariums, and modern artillery. Qianlong, now 82, received Macartney in his summer retreat. He treated the British envoy not as a rival superpower, but as a tribute-bearer from a distant, savage land. The meeting was a collision of two worlds that did not understand each other's gravity. Macartney refused to kowtow, bang his head on the floor, merely bending his knee. Qianlong, insulted but magnanimous, sent a famous edict to King George III. "We possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures."
Qianlong believed he was stating a fact. He looked around his summer palace filled with the tribute of Asia and saw a world that would last forever. He did not know that the artillery Macartney brought was not a toy, but a prophecy. He did not know that the Industrial Revolution was forging a new kind of power that did not care about the mandate of heaven. Qianlong died in 1799, taking the 18th century with him. His son, the Jia Qing Emperor, immediately arrested Heshen and forced him to commit suicide. But the damage was done. The silver was gone. The army, once the wolf of the steppes, had grown fat and lazy, their bows rotting in the damp armories. The White Lotus Rebellion was burning in the interior, requiring years and millions of taels of silver to suppress. As the 19th century dawned, the Qing Empire was like a magnificent porcelain vase, beautiful, ancient, and intricate. But it was filled with cracks that had been painted over with gold. And across the ocean, the iron ships were stoking their furnaces. The storm was coming, and this time there would be no wall to stop it. Chapter 3: The Smoke and the Sea, 1800 to 1860. The collapse of a civilization does not always begin with the thunder of cannons. Sometimes it begins with a scent. In the early 19th century, the coastal winds of southern China began to carry a new, sickly sweet odor. It hung heavy in the humid air of Canton, Guangzhou, drifting from the back rooms of dockside taverns into the private courtyards of the wealthy, and eventually into the barracks of the imperial army. It was the smell of burning opium. To the British East India Company, this substance was a miracle of economics. For decades, the British had been bleeding silver into China. They were addicted to Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. But the Qing Empire, self-sufficient and proud, had no interest in British wool or clocks. The trade imbalance was bankrupting the British treasury. They needed a commodity that the Chinese could not refuse, something that would create its own demand. They found it in the poppy fields of British-occupied India. They processed it into sticky black balls of resin, packed it into wooden chests, and shipped it to the Pearl River Delta. They called it free trade. The Chinese called it foreign mud. The somatic reality of opium addiction is horrific and consuming. It starts as a release, a floating detachment from the hardships of life, but it quickly becomes a cage. By the 1830s, the foreign mud had ravaged the coastal provinces. It did not discriminate by class. Coolies smoked it to numb the pain of breaking rocks. Scholars smoked it to chase poetic inspiration. Manchu bannermen, the descendants of the fierce warriors who had conquered China, smoked it until their hands shook too much to draw a bowstring. It is estimated that up to 10 million Chinese were addicted. The social fabric was unraveling. Families sold their daughters to buy the drug. But for the Qing court, the most terrifying symptom was economic. For the first time in history, silver was flowing out of China. The empire was being drained of its blood.
In the Forbidden City, the Daoguang emperor saw the rot spreading. He knew that if the opium trade continued, there would be no soldiers left to fight the enemy and no silver left to pay the army. In 1838, he made a fateful decision. He did not choose a diplomat to solve this problem. He chose a hammer. He summoned Lin Zexu, a governor-general known for his incorruptibility and his fierce intellect. Lin was a blue-sky official, a man of such moral clarity that he could not be bribed or intimidated. The emperor gave him a mandate: go to Canton and do not return until the opium is gone. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton in March 1839 with the force of a typhoon. He did not negotiate. He immediately arrested Chinese opium dealers and ordered the foreign merchants to surrender their entire stock. When the British merchants, led by the Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliot, refused and tried to stall, Lin did the unthinkable. He locked them in. He barricaded the 13 factories, the foreign trading district, cutting off supplies of food and water. For 6 weeks, the wealthiest merchants of the British Empire were prisoners in their own warehouses, sweating in the tropical heat, stripped of their servants and their dignity. Broken by the siege, the British capitulated. They surrendered over 20,000 chests of opium. What followed was one of the most famous acts of defiance in Chinese history. In June 1839, on the beach at Humen, Lin Zexu dug massive trenches. He did not burn the opium, lest the scavengers dig up the residue. Instead, he filled the trenches with water and salt, threw in the opium, and added quicklime. The chemical reaction caused the water to boil and hiss, a churning cauldron of white foam that dissolved the black poison. For 23 days, Lin stood on the beach, watching millions of pounds of British profit wash out into the sea. He even wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, a beautifully argued moral plea that asked, by what right do they use the poisonous drug to injure the Chinese people? The letter was never delivered, and Lin Zexu, in his moment of moral triumph, made a catastrophic miscalculation. He believed he was dealing with rogue smugglers who would be cowed by the emperor's law. He did not understand that behind those merchants stood the most powerful navy the world had ever seen. He thought he had flushed a vice down the drain. In reality, he had pulled the trigger of a war that would shatter the sky. In London, the destruction of the opium was not viewed as a moral stand. It was viewed as the destruction of Her Majesty's property. The lobbying of the merchants was ferocious. Parliament debated for 3 days, but the conclusion was a foregone conclusion, driven by the iron logic of empire. China had to be opened. In June 1840, a British expeditionary force arrived off the coast of Canton. It was not a large fleet by Napoleonic standards, but it contained a monster that would change naval warfare forever. Its name was the Nemesis. The Nemesis was the first iron-hulled steamship to be deployed in active combat. To the Chinese observers standing on the forts of the Pearl River, it was a hallucination. It had no sails, yet it moved against the wind. It belched black smoke like a dragon. It drew only 5 feet of water, allowing it to glide over the mudflats and shallow rivers where the heavy Chinese war junks could not go. The collision between the Qing Navy and the Nemesis was not a battle, it was an execution. In a single engagement at the Bogue forts, the Nemesis fired a Congreve rocket, a screaming projectile that trailed fire, into a Chinese junk. The wooden ship, packed with gunpowder, disintegrated in a blinding flash. The British gunners described the scene with cold professional detachment, while the Chinese defenders fought with a courage that was heartbreakingly futile.
Manchu bannermen, the descendants of the wolf warriors, stood on the ramparts with matchlock muskets that hadn't changed since the 1600s. They fired at the British ships, but their bullets simply pinged off the iron hulls. They watched as the British shells, fused to explode on impact, turned their stone forts into gravel. Many Qing commanders, realizing the impossibility of victory, committed suicide rather than face the shame of reporting defeat to the emperor. They slit their throats on the battlements as the Union Jack rose above the smoke. The war moved north, up the coast, strangling the empire's trade. The British seized the Grand Canal, the artery that fed Beijing. The Daoguang Emperor, watching his reports turn from denial to panic, finally capitulated. On August 29, 1842, the humiliating finale took place on the deck of the HMS Cornwallis, anchored in the Yangtze River. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed. It was the first of the unequal treaties. The terms were a somatic shock to the Chinese body politic. China was forced to pay 21 million silver dollars as reparations for the war and the destroyed opium. 5 ports, including Shanghai, were forced open to foreign trade. And, perhaps most painfully, a small rocky island called Hong Kong was ceded to Queen Victoria in perpetuity.
The door had been kicked off its hinges. But the British were not satisfied. They wanted more markets, more access, more opium. Tensions simmered for a decade until they boiled over again in the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860. This time, the British were joined by the French, and they marched not just on the coast, but on the heart of the empire, Beijing. In October 1860, the foreign armies reached the northwest suburbs of the capital. They found the Yuanming Yuan, the old summer palace, Qianlong's garden of perfect brightness. The emperor had fled, leaving the magnificent complex undefended. What happened next is a cultural trauma that China has never forgotten. Lord Elgin, the British High Commissioner, wanted to punish the Qing court for the torture and death of a diplomatic delegation. He ordered the complete destruction of the Summer Palace. It took 3,500 British troops 3 days to burn it down. The sensory scale of the destruction is overwhelming. The sky over Beijing turned black with the smoke of burning cedar and sandalwood. Soldiers smashed porcelain vases that were older than the British Empire. They looted gold, silk, and jade, filling their pockets with treasures they couldn't name. The Pekingese dogs, bred exclusively for the imperial family, were seized. One was taken to England and gifted to Queen Victoria, ironically named Lootie. As the flames consumed the pavilions, the intricate clockwork fountains, and the libraries of ancient scrolls, it was more than just a palace burning. It was the physical incineration of the Qing mystique. The high noon of Qianlong was reduced to ash and rubble, leaving behind a scar of stone columns that stand to this day. The Qing Dynasty was still alive, but its spirit was broken. It was now a hostage in its own home, ruling only by the permission of the foreigners who have burned its paradise. Chapter 4. The Empress and the Fire, 1850 to 1900. While the British and French were tearing down the gates from the outside, a fire was already consuming the house from the inside. We must travel south, deep into the green, humid hills of Guangxi province to find the spark that would ignite the deadliest civil war in human history. It began with a fever dream. Hung Shu Quan was a village school teacher, a man broken by the rigid demands of the Qing examination system. He had failed the civil service exams 4 times, a failure that meant a life of poverty and irrelevance. After his final failure in 1837, he collapsed into a delirium that lasted for days.
In his hallucinations, he saw a golden-bearded man who gave him a sword and told him to slay the demons destroying the world. Years later, after reading a Christian tract given to him by a missionary, Hung interpreted his vision with terrifying certainty. The golden-bearded man was God the Father, and he, Hung Shu-quan, was the younger brother of Jesus Christ.
The demons were the Manchus. From this delusion grew the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. It was a movement that promised a utopia on Earth. Land would be shared equally, men and women would be equal, though segregated, and the foreign devils of the Qing would be exterminated. To the starving peasants of the South who had been battered by famine and banditry, this message was intoxicating. They cut off their queues, the symbol of Qing submission, and let their hair grow long. They became the long-haired rebels. By 1853, the Taiping army had swelled to over 1 million fanatics. They swept north like a biblical plague, capturing the great city of Nanjing and declaring it their heavenly capital. The violence was total. When the Taipings took a city, they didn't just occupy it, they cleansed it. In Nanjing, they herded 40,000 Manchu men, women, and children to the city walls and butchered them. The Yangtze River was choked with corpses. This war was not fought for territory. It was fought for the soul of China. It would claim at least 20 million lives, more than World War I. While the empire was bleeding to death in the south, a different kind of power struggle was unfolding in the hushed, incense-filled rooms of the Forbidden City. In 1850, the Daoguan Emperor died, and his son, the Xianfang Emperor, took the throne. But the most important arrival in the palace was not a man. It was a 16-year-old girl named Yehenara. She entered the harem as a low-ranking concubine, one of many meant to serve the emperor's pleasure. But she possessed a sharp intelligence and a voice that could charm birds from the trees. When she gave birth to the emperor's only surviving son, her status was secured. She was given the title Cixi. In 1861, the Xianfang Emperor died, shattered by the stress of the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion. He left the throne to his 5-year-old son, Tongji. The power vacuum was immediate. A group of 8 conservative regents plotted to control the child emperor, but they underestimated the young mother. In a daring coup known as the Xinyu coup, Cixi conspired with the late emperor's brother, Prince Gong. They arrested the regents and executed their leaders. At the age of 26, Cixi became the Empress Dowager. For the next 47 years, she would rule China from behind the curtain. It was literally so. During court audiences, the child emperor sat on the throne, while Cixi sat behind a yellow silk screen, whispering instructions. She was a woman ruling a deeply patriarchal society, a feat that required a ruthlessness that terrified her enemies. She was a master manipulator, playing factions against each other to ensure her own survival.
Under her watch, the Qing attempted one final, desperate gasp of modernization, the self-strengthening movement. Led by Han generals like Zhong Guofan, who finally crushed the Taiping Rebellion in 1864, the empire tried to learn from its conquerors. They built shipyards, arsenals, and translated Western science texts. Chinese learning for the essential principles, Western learning for practical application, was the slogan. For a brief moment, during the Tongji Restoration, it seemed to work. The rebellions were crushed, the fields were replanted. But the rot was too deep. The funds meant for a modern navy were famously diverted by Cixi to rebuild the summer palace, including a useless marble boat that sat in the lake as a monument to vanity, while the Japanese navy was building ironclads. In 1895, the First Sino-Japanese War shattered the illusion of recovery. Japan, a nation China had always viewed as a dwarf neighbor, annihilated the Qing fleet.
The humiliation was absolute. Panic set in. The young Guangxu emperor, Cici's nephew, whom she had installed on the throne, tried to launch a radical reform movement in 1898, the 100 Days Reform. He wanted to turn China into a constitutional monarchy like Britain or Japan. He wanted to abolish the old exam system and modernize the entire state overnight. But Cixi, now an old woman who saw threats in every shadow, viewed this as a coup against her power and Manchu privilege. With the support of the conservative army, she struck back. She placed the emperor under house arrest on a tiny island in the middle of the palace lakes. She executed the reformers. The old Buddha, as she was called, had chosen survival of the dynasty over survival of the nation. But the fire was rising again, and this time she would make a mistake that would burn the house down. By 1899, the sky over North China had turned a bruised, dusty yellow. The rains had failed. The Yellow River, usually the bloodline of the province, had dried to a cracked scar in the earth. In the villages of Shandong, the wheat withered in the fields, and the wells puffed dust. Hunger is a potent hallucinogen, and when mixed with the humiliation of foreign occupation, it breathes monsters. From this parched earth rose the Yihatuan, the righteous and harmonious fists. The West called them boxers because of their martial arts rituals. They were not soldiers, they were desperate young men, boatmen thrown out of work by foreign steamships and farmers with no crops to harvest. They believed that the drought was caused by the foreign missionaries and their railways, which they claimed disturbed the feng shui of the land and angered the dragon spirits.
The Boxers practiced a terrifying form of spirit possession. They would swallow written charms, chant incantations, and work themselves into a trance until they foamed at the mouth. In this state, they believed they were possessed by the gods of Chinese opera. Crucially, they believed in Shen Quan, spiritual immunity. They were convinced that foreign bullets would not harm them, that swords could not cut their flesh. They tied red sashes around their waists and marched toward Beijing under the slogan, "Support the Qing, destroy the foreigner." Empress Dowager Cixi watched this rising tide from the summer palace. Her advisors were split. Some warned her that the Boxers were a rabble that would bring ruin. But Cixi hated the foreigners with a visceral intensity. She hated their arrogance, their technology, and their demands. In the Boxers, she saw a weapon, a way to finally scour the barbarians from her land. In June 1900, she made the most catastrophic decision of her life. She issued an imperial edict declaring war not just on one nation, but on all of them. The Qing Empire was now at war with Great Britain, France, Germany, the United States, Russia, Japan, Italy, and Austria-Hungary simultaneously. The target was the legation quarter in Beijing, a small diplomatic district huddled under the city walls. For 55 days, the world watched in horror as the siege unfolded. Inside the compound, a few hundred foreign Marines and thousands of Chinese Christians held out against waves of Boxer fanatics and Qing imperial troops. The sensory reality of the siege was grim, the smell of rotting horse carcasses. The defenders ate their racing ponies to survive. The sweltering heat of the Beijing summer and the constant, unnerving chant of "Sha, Sha, Sha," kill, 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 echoing from the streets outside. But the Boxers' magic failed. The bullets did not turn to water. They tore through flesh. Wave after wave of young men charged the foreign machine guns, armed only with swords and belief, and were mown down in heaps. In August 1900, the retribution arrived.
The Eight-Nation Alliance, a multinational army, marched on Beijing. They cut through the Qing defenses like a hot knife through butter. When they entered the city, the discipline of the civilized nations collapsed completely. Beijing was sacked. It was a carnage that exceeded even the destruction of the Summer Palace 40 years earlier. Soldiers from 8 nations engaged in an orgy of looting, rape, and murder. They used the Forbidden City as a stable for their horses. They stole the astronomical instruments from the observatory. They hunted suspected boxers in the streets, beheading them without trial.
As the foreign armies breached the city gates, Cixi did something that marked the true end of her dignity. She cut her long silver fingernails, the symbol of her leisurely status. She stripped off her silk robes and dressed in the rough blue cotton of a peasant woman. With the Emperor Guangxu in tow, the old Buddha fled the capital in a wooden cart, heading west into the dusty interior of Xi'an. She had bet the empire on a superstition, and she had lost everything. She returned to Beijing a year later, in 1902, only after signing the Boxer Protocol. It was a treaty of total humiliation. China was forced to pay a crushing indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, 1 tael for every man, woman, and child in the empire, to be paid over 39 years. Foreign troops were now permanently stationed in Beijing. The Qing Dynasty was no longer a sovereign government. It was a debt collector for the Western powers. Cixi lived for another 6 years. In a bitter irony, she spent her final years trying to implement the very reforms she had crushed in 1898. She abolished the exam system, promised a constitution, and banned foot-binding. But it was too little, too late. The mandate was gone. On November 14, 1908, the Guangxu Emperor died, poisoned, modern forensics reveals, with a massive dose of arsenic. 1 day later, Cixi herself died. The 2 figures who had dominated the last half-century of the dynasty were gone within 24 hours of each other. But before she closed her eyes, Cixi performed one final act of state. She did not choose a mature prince to guide the ship through the storm. She chose a child. A 2-year-old boy named Puyi was plucked from his crib and placed on the dragon throne. The fate of 400 million people was now in the hands of a toddler who cried at the sight of the bearded officials. The stage was set for the final curtain.
Chapter 5. The Empty Throne, 1900 to 1912. The final act of the Qing Dynasty begins not with a roar, but with a whimper. It is the winter of 1908, bitter and gray. Inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the air is freezing. A toddler, barely 3 years old, is perched on the immense golden dragon throne. His name is Puyi. He is terrified. The drums are beating, the bells are ringing, and hundreds of officials in court robes are kneeling before him, chanting 10,000 years. To a child, this sea of bowing strangers is a nightmare. He begins to cry. He struggles, trying to climb off the throne, asking to go home. His father, Prince Chun, kneeling beside him to keep him steady, whispers desperately, "Don't cry, don't cry. It will be over soon." The courtiers heard those words and shuddered. They were meant to comfort a child, but they sounded like a prophecy. It will be over soon. Outside the high red walls, the prophecy was already coming true. The China of 1908 was not the China of 1644. The wolf that had breached the wall had become a toothless old man. The railways that Cixi had feared were now carrying revolutionary pamphlets written by students returning from Tokyo and Paris.
These young men and women did not want to restore the Ming, they wanted a republic. They cut their queues in secret, hiding their short hair under hats, a somatic rejection of the Manchu yoke. Their spiritual leader was Sun Yat-sen, a doctor turned revolutionary who had spent years in exile, raising money and preaching the three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and livelihood. But revolutions are rarely started by philosophers. They are started by accidents. On October 9, 1911, in the city of Wuchang on the banks of the Yangtze, a group of revolutionaries was building bombs in the Russian concession. A cigarette ash fell into a pan of gunpowder. The resulting explosion blew the roof off the safe house. The Qing police arrived to investigate and found a membership list of the Revolutionary Society. The officers in the local New Army, the modern military force the Qing had built to save themselves, realized their names were on that list. They faced a choice: inevitable execution the next morning or immediate mutiny. They chose mutiny.
On October 10, the Double 10, the soldiers stormed the governor's office. The Wuchang uprising had begun. It was not a coordinated national strike. It was a desperate spasm of survival. But the Qing state was so brittle that this single crack shattered the entire vase. Within weeks, province after province declared independence. The governors, the generals, and the gentry simply stopped answering the phone from Beijing. The queue, the symbol of submission that had been enforced by the sword for 260 years, disappeared from the streets of the South almost overnight. Men sat on street corners with scissors, weeping or cheering as the hair was sheared off. In the Forbidden City, there was panic. The regent, Prince Chun, looked at the map and saw the empire turning red with rebellion. He had no choice but to call upon the only man who commanded the loyalty of the modern Beiyang army, General Yuan Shikai. Yuan was a Machiavellian figure, a man of immense girth and immense ambition. He did not care about the Manchus, and he did not care about the Republic. He cared about power. He played a masterful double game. He marched his army south and crushed the revolutionaries in battle, proving to the court that he could save them. Then he stopped. He turned back to Beijing and told the Empress Dowager Cixi, the widow who was regent for the child Puyi, that the situation was hopeless. He told the revolutionaries he could force the emperor to abdicate, but only if he, Yuan Shikai, was made president of the new republic. He held the emperor hostage to get the presidency, and held the presidency hostage to get the emperor. It was the final betrayal. February 12, 1912. The dawn over Beijing was cold and pale. Inside the Hall of Mental Cultivation, the same room where the Yongzheng emperor had worked himself to death by candlelight, a final, mournful ceremony was taking place. There was no Golden Age sunlight here anymore. The windows were papered over, dimming the room. The Empress Dowager Cixi sat on a chair, her face swollen from weeping. Opposite her stood the ministers of the Grand Council, men who had spent their lives studying Confucian classics that were now obsolete. They presented her with the document. It was not a treaty with a foreign power, nor a declaration of war. It was the Imperial Abdication Edict. The language of the edict was heartbreakingly dignified. It did not admit defeat. It claimed to yield to the will of the cosmos. The hearts of the people are in favor of the Republic, it read. How could we, for the sake of the glory of one family, thwart the will of heaven? With a trembling hand, the Empress applied the imperial seal.
The heavy thud of the red ink hitting the paper was the sound of a door slamming shut on 2,000 years of imperial history. In that moment, the Qing Dynasty ended, but the strange twilight existence of Puyi had just begun. Under the Articles of Favorable Treatment, the new republic agreed to let the emperor keep his title. He was allowed to live inside the Forbidden City, surrounded by his eunuchs and courtiers, receiving a stipend of 4 million silver dollars a year. It was a surreal compromise. Outside the gates, China was cutting its hair, wearing Western suits and driving automobiles. Inside the gates, it was still 1793. The eunuchs still kowtowed. The tutors still taught the ancient texts. Puyi grew up in this golden cage, a prisoner of his own heritage, believing he was still the ruler of the world, unaware that his empire now ended at the moat. This kingdom of the walls lasted for 12 years. It was a theater of ghosts. The eunuchs stole the treasures, selling invaluable porcelain to antique dealers to pay for their gambling debts. The paint on the palaces peeled. Weeds grew in the cracks of the vast marble courtyards where the armies had once assembled. The final eviction came in 1924. The warlord Feng Yushang, a Christian general who baptized his troops with a fire hose, marched into Beijing. He had no patience for the theater. He sent soldiers to the Forbidden City with a simple order: get out. Puyi was eating an apple when the soldiers arrived. He was given 3 hours to pack. The sensory shock of that day was the silence. For the first time in centuries, the chanting stopped. The rituals ceased. The last emperor walked out of the gate of divine might as a private citizen, Mr. Aisin Jioro Puyi. He left behind the dragon throne, the clocks of Qianlong, and the ghost of Cixi. The gates were sealed. The throne was empty.
Finale. Stand now in the center of the Forbidden City. It is no longer the home of the Son of Heaven. It is the Palace Museum. The crowds of tourists in baseball caps and sneakers wander where only the chosen few could once tread. They take photos with their phones, capturing the red walls and the golden tiles. But wait for a moment. Let the noise of the crowd fade. Look up at the sweeping eaves of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, pointing toward the sky like the wings of a phoenix. History is a heavy thing. It is built from the bones of the starved, the ink of the scholars, the ashes of the summer palace, and the tears of a child emperor. The Qing Dynasty began with a man on a horse in the frozen north, conquering the world with iron and will. It ended with a boy in a garden, holding a cricket cage, watching the sun set over a wall he was never allowed to cross. The throne sits inside the hall, dusty and silent. The dragon is gone. But if you listen closely to the wind whistling through the courtyards, you can still hear the echo. It is the sound of an empire that thought it would last forever, whispering the oldest lesson of all. The sun sets, the walls fall, and the river flows on.